If I give you one message to hold in your hearts today, it's this: treat the word impossible as nothing more than motivation. Relish the opportunity to be an outsider, because it's the outsiders who change the world and who make a real and lasting difference. The more that a broken system tells you that you're wrong, the more certain you should be that you must keep pushing ahead. You must keep pushing forward.
Hi, everyone. I'm Bruce Karasik, co-founder of the Jewish Republican Alliance, and we're so happy to have Alan Dershowitz here with us today. We'll be talking with Professor Dershowitz in just a few minutes. But first, on February 17th, 2020, the Jewish Republican Alliance hosted a luncheon with Alan Dershowitz. If you may recall, it was right after the impeachment hearings of President Trump. I had the distinct honor of picking up Alan from his hotel and driving him back to his hotel after the event. And we had such an enjoyable conversation, and one which I will never forget. I want to tell you that this man is a national treasure and someone whom I greatly admire. We are forever grateful for your historic presentation on Capitol Hill at the impeachment trial. This presentation, I am sure, will be studied by law students and scholars for generations to come and be remembered as a powerful constitutional argument leading to President Trump's acquittal. So much has happened to us all since February of this year, but now it is time to use Professor Dershowitz's, what he has taught for years, the shoe on the other foot test. On August 12th, 2017, he wrote, "For me, the primary test of whether an argument is principled or partisan is the shoe on the other foot test. The time has come for all Americans who believe in enduring principles of morality and justice to insist on consistency." And so now I ask Democrats to answer these questions with the shoe on the other foot test in mind. If Democrats were being censored by big tech, their giants, what would they say then? If the media refused to cover Watergate, just as they refused to cover the potential corruption of Joe and Hunter Biden and the allegations made by Mr. Belinsky and on the laptop, what would they say? If Democrats were beaten and killed in the streets by the right and Republican leaders and either encouraged it or denied it, what would you say? If Democrats were fired from their jobs or had their businesses ruined simply by exercising their free speech, what would you say? When a Republican president does more for Jews and Israel than almost any president in my lifetime, would Jews on the left support him as they did FDR or dismiss him because he is not a Democrat? What are the Democrats to say if a Republican opponent had an anti-Semite like Linda Sarsour speak at their convention? If only college campuses allowed speech that coincided with Republican doctrine or hired professors and teachers that are almost all conservatives, what would they say? And finally, if President Obama seemed to have lost the election in 2008, and if many of the most respected lawyers of our time put their reputations on the line and brought allegations of massive fraud with sworn affidavits as evidence, would Democrats want to hear all the evidence, or would they have labeled that a conspiracy theory? What would you say if the press simply acted as an arm of the opposing party and refused to investigate allegations or only covered Republicans favorably? So today, we look forward to an open and fair discussion with Professor Alan Dershowitz, one of the greatest constitutional minds of our time. I thank you all for being here. And now I'd like to introduce fellow co-founder Mitch Silberman. Mitch?
Hello, JRA community. It's always so great when we are together, especially now. We have to be JRA strong. Earlier this week, we heard a phrase, "It's time to release the Kraken." And I chuckled when I heard that. It's from a 1981 film called Clash of the Titans. The Kraken was a behemoth, a monstrous beast that destroyed everything in its path. So when Sidney Powell mentioned that, it brought a smile to my face. I understood the reference. So I have to wonder, is there really a Kraken to be released? There was an amazing press conference yesterday, which of course the major media did not cover, but there was a lot revealed yesterday. And so I have to wonder, would people of her magnitude, like Sidney Powell, Rudy Giuliani, Lynn Wood, would they really risk their entire professional careers and reputations if they didn't have the goods to back it up? Listen, I know in my heart this was a fraudulent election, okay? There's so much that doesn't add up. As my grandmother of beloved memory used to say, it stinks to high heaven. I mean, all of the rooms being boarded up and all the mysterious votes coming in the middle of the night and all the swing states stopping counting the vote the night of the election. And how come only Democrats receive votes from dead people? I mean, the list goes on and on. Dominion, Smartmatic. The more we find out, the more horrific it is that this was not a free and fair election. And so there's going to be information released. We have to be open-minded. We deserve to know the truth. But when you have 70 million people feeling this was not a free and fair election, that's a real issue. And you know, I'll leave you with this question. In 2016, when Hillary lost, she never stopped bellyaching about how she lost, why she lost. It was Russian interference. President Trump was a Russian tool, a Russian asset, a Russian collusion, Russia, you name it. But the one thing I don't recall her ever asking is for a recount. Now, why is that? I find it very interesting. I mean, the enormity of the fraud that we are seeing has taken years in the making. It didn't just happen overnight. So she didn't campaign in swing states, and then but of all the complaining, there was never a demand for a recount. Why? I don't know. Maybe if there was a recount, all the fraud would have been unearthed and she just didn't want that. Who knows? And I'll share with you, I had a fortunate time that I was able to have breakfast with Donald Trump Jr. early into President Trump's first term. And I asked him, what is your dad's biggest challenge? And he said, the world. And boy, nothing has changed since then. And then I also asked him, what's your dad's biggest joy? And he gave me this amazing grin and he said, winning. So let's hope we have more of that. We have an amazing fighter in the White House and the truth has to be unearthed. And I read something yesterday from a former JRA speaker, Lieutenant Colonel Buzz Patterson. I'm going to paraphrase. In a nutshell, our election was run with voting machines and software from Canada and Venezuela that were unsecure. The votes were counted in Germany and Spain. Did you know that? And senior leadership at Dominion is aligned with George Soros. Hey, what could go wrong? Well, here we are. So it is now my distinct pleasure to introduce our very special guest, Alan Dershowitz. He's a Brooklyn native and has been called the nation's most peripatetic civil liberties lawyer, one of its most distinguished defenders of individual rights, the best known criminal lawyer in the world, the top lawyer of last resort, and America's most public Jewish defender. He is the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. Dershowitz, a graduate of Brooklyn College and Yale Law School, joined the Harvard Law School faculty at age 25. Amazing. Dershowitz, the author of 40 works of fiction and nonfiction, including 7 bestsellers. More than 1 million of his books have been sold worldwide in numerous languages, and more than 1 million people have heard him lecture around the world. His 2 most recent books are The Case Against Impeaching Trump and Guilt by Accusation. He also has a podcast called The Dershow. Professor Dershowitz, welcome to the Jewish Republican Alliance.
Well, thank you so much. And I appreciate the introduction, mentioning the shoe on the other foot test. It's a test that I will apply to everything I say today, some of which you may agree with, some of which you may not agree with. But let's start the conversation. I'm roaring to go.
Fantastic. Thank you. So, you know, when all this came up with the potential fraud, the first person I thought of that I needed to find out what his thought was on this was the constitutional expert, because everybody's giving different sides of whether this is reality or not. But what do you think the key legal arguments are right now? And where do you think this is going to go based on those arguments?
Well, I think the strategy of the very excellent lawyers who are trying to reverse this presumptive victory for Joe Biden, the strategy is not to get Donald Trump to 270 electoral votes. I think they've given up on that. I think the strategy is to try to deny Biden 270 electoral votes, and thereby throw the election into the House of Representatives, where there are 26 out of 50 Republican delegations. It would be like the election of 1800, 1824, and two other elections in the 19th century. For that to happen would require really a perfect storm. It would require first constitutional issues, and there are good ones. The Pennsylvania constitutional challenge will probably win if it gets to the Supreme Court. That's my judgment and prediction. Let's go over what that challenge is. The legislature refused to extend beyond the close of election day ballots received by mail. In other words, if ballots were sent before the close of election day, but received within 3 days thereafter, the legislature said you can't count them. But the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania said because of COVID, you could count them. That may have been a reasonable and rational decision, but the Constitution doesn't permit it, is the argument. The Constitution says only the legislature shall determine, the state legislature shall determine how electors are chosen. So we know already that Justice Alito seems to side with that, and there probably were 4 justices on that side before the appointment of the newest Justice, Amy Coney Barrett. So I think that case would win in the Supreme Court 5-4 or 6-3, but in order to avoid it being just a Pyrrhic victory, there'd have to be a sufficient number of votes challenged under that constitutional issue, sufficient to offset the difference between the Biden votes and the Trump votes. At the moment, we know that the difference, according to the preliminary vote, is around 60,000. What we don't know is how many challenged votes there are. I've heard figures 20, 30, 40. I haven't heard a figure in excess of 60. It may be. So unless that challenge, coupled with other challenges, the Philadelphia challenges based on lack of access to the counting, the fraud allegations, unless the number of challenged ballots exceeds or comes close to at least the difference, the margin of victory, that would be a Pyrrhic victory. But if they could manage to turn around Pennsylvania, that deprives Biden of 20 votes. That brings him down to 286, just 17 away from having the matter thrown to the House. Let's remember too that the Constitution is very explicit. It says if the electors don't cast a majority for one candidate, then the election goes, and here's the words of the Constitution, immediately, twice in the Constitution, once in the body of the Constitution, Article 2, once in the 12th Amendment, the word immediately is used. And so it means you don't get vote after vote after vote in the Electoral College. Once it goes to the House, you can have vote after vote after vote. I think there were more than 30 votes by the House before the House decided to elect Thomas Jefferson over Aaron Burr in 1800. But to reduce the number, say Pennsylvania goes for Trump, reduce the number from 286 to 269, you'd have to win at least 2 other states. Georgia, now there's been a recount in Georgia, and it came out with Biden ahead by around 12,000 votes or something thereabouts. Those are being challenged. Wisconsin, Michigan, Arizona, and Nevada. The key to success, if there is to be success for President Trump, would be in the computers. And there was mentioned in the introduction, and of course, Sidney Powell and all the other lawyers have focused on the computers. The computers, we just need evidence. I haven't seen it. I've heard allegations, but they have to produce expert testimony. The mere fact that the votes were counted in Germany or in Canada, that the machines were manufactured in Venezuela, those are all causes for suspicion. But the burden is on the plaintiff, and the plaintiff would have to show sufficient votes to turn around 2 additional states in addition to Pennsylvania. It's a tall order. There's a big difference. There are 2 kinds of challenges, and I'll finish this answer with this point. There are 2 kinds of challenges. There are wholesale constitutional, well, 3 kinds, let me say. Wholesale constitutional challenges. The paradigm for that is Pennsylvania. It's constitutional. And it's wholesale because you don't have to count individual votes. You know that a certain number of votes came in after election day. So that's a wholesale challenge. That is the best chance of winning. Then there are retail constitutional challenges. Oh, a ballot here and there, maybe denial of constitutional right to observe, but it's retail. It's vote by vote, and it's hard to get a number of votes that exceeds the margin. And then there's the third category, which is interesting, which is wholesale, that is the computers, but it's a mix of federal and state. The challenge to the computers would have to go first to state court. Why? It was the states that decided on which computers to use. Remember, people often forget this. There's no such thing as a national election for president. There are 50 state elections, and each of the 50 state elections is determined by rules established by the state legislature. State legislatures pick the companies, or they authorize to others, they delegate to others the picking of the company. So the challenge would have to first go through the state court. Then, if there were denials of equal protection, it could go into the federal court in the way that Bush versus Gore went first through the state court and then through the federal court. I was one of the lawyers in Bush versus Gore. Just 60 seconds. I think you will be very interested in this. It's a shoe on the other foot point. So I was the lawyer in Bush versus Gore for the Jewish voters of Palm Beach County. How did I get involved? I got a call from Rabbi Yellen, who was the reform rabbi in the Palm Beach big synagogue, about noontime on election day, saying, "Oh, do we have tsuris here?" What's the problem? The problem is the butterfly ballot. There's a ballot that's illegal. The holes in the ballot that you punch are supposed to be to the right of the name of the candidate. So if you see the name Al Gore and there's a hole to the right, you punch it. But to save money, they put the hole in the middle, and there was confusion. And a lot of Jews ended up voting for Pat Buchanan for president. Now, there isn't a single Jew in the world that would ever vote for Pat Buchanan. Donald Trump, that's one thing. Pat Buchanan, no way. And there were hundreds of Pat Buchanan votes in largely Jewish districts of Palm Beach County. So that was the challenge. Ultimately, the decision was made not by me, I opposed it, but by the Gore legal team not to pursue that challenge, because what would be the remedy? You can't take the Pat Buchanan votes and just give them to Al Gore. So there would be no remedy. They didn't pursue that. But these are hard challenges to make, and they prevailed for the Republicans in Bush versus Gore, which is why I think people are somewhat encouraged that the Supreme Court might step into the case. But they will only step into the case if they believe that their decision would make the difference in the outcome of the election. They're not going to give one side or another a Pyrrhic victory. They're not going to decide an abstract question. They're only going to resolve cases and controversies. So if you ask me what my bet is, if I were betting widows and orphans money that they couldn't afford to lose, and I needed to make a safe bet, the bet would have to be that on January 20th, Joe Biden will become the president of the United States. If you're asking me whether the lawyers should pursue these challenges, they're reasonable challenges, and no lawyer should be condemned. No lawyer should be threatened with disbarment. Having said that, let me turn to one other point, which I'm sure you're going to ask me about, but I might as well suggest it now. I don't know if any of you saw what's going on at Harvard, where a petition by students to make sure that people like me, I'm a liberal Democrat, I voted for Hillary Clinton, but people like me who helped Donald Trump in any way can't be speaking at Harvard, can't teach at Harvard, can't be a student at Harvard, probably can't be a janitor at Harvard, unless they go through some re-education program to make sure that we realize the sin of our ways and convert and go back to kind of re-education camp like the Chinese communists have or the apartheid country in South Africa had. So there are those efforts, and they're led by AOC, the greatest gift the Democrats ever gave to the Republican Party. The woman in her squad, who I think was responsible for the Democrats losing so many seats in Congress because of her radicalism. But beware, there will be efforts to punish you. There will be efforts to punish you economically, politically, maybe even legally. And it will come from the hard left. It will come from colleges and universities. And let me tell you what my response is. I have offered to represent pro bono any Trump supporter, any Trump helper, any Trump administration person who is denied access to Harvard. I will become your lawyer pro bono. Number one. Number two, I will speak at Harvard as soon as the coronavirus threat is over, as soon as the vaccine comes into being, hopefully in the spring. I will speak at Harvard. And although I'm a liberal Democrat, here's my speech. My speech is going to be about the positive aspects of the Trump administration. People will boo me, people will yell at me, people will throw things at me, but I will make that speech because the students at Harvard don't hear that. They will hear about the Abraham Accords. They will hear about peace between Israel and the Gulf states. They will hear that I believe that those accords deserve the Nobel Peace Prize, that it was the most important accomplishment for peace this past year, and that those who brought it about deserve to be considered for the Nobel Prize. I will get booed, I will get shouted at, I will get shouted down when I make that speech. I will also talk about the impeachment and why it was right to oppose the impeachment and why it's wrong for Letitia James and others in New York to be going after President Trump selectively for alleged criminal purposes. So I will become the most unpopular person in Harvard University campus, but I will do it out of principle because, again, if the shoe were on the other foot, where would I be? Imagine if you had white supremacists saying anybody who worked in the Obama administration won't be welcome on campus. Nobody would accept that. And this McCarthyism is not particularly different. So I join you in a number of areas. I'm different from you in other areas. I wrote a book recently called The Case for Liberalism in a Time of Extremism, or Why I Left the Left but Couldn't Join the Right. So I'm not with you as Republicans. I support a woman's right to choose. I support gay marriage. I support great concern for the environment. I support reasonable gun control. I support Medicare, Medicaid reform to broaden it. I support separation of church and state, gay rights, a range of other issues where I would depart from the Republican platform. But I agree with you that elections must be fair. I agree with you that people should not be punished for their political views. I agree with you that President Trump did a great many good things, not only for the Jewish community and for Israel, but in general. So we have areas of agreement, we have areas of disagreement, and let's continue the conversation. Please challenge me on my areas of disagreement as well.
Well, Professor Dershowitz, you're not only a man of courage, but you're a mensch.
Thank you.
So really, really fantastic. One of the philosophies I live with is when all else fails, use common sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to ask you a legal question. I want to make this a common sense question.
Sure.
We would have to believe that President Trump has been, we know for a fact that his approval rating amongst registered Republicans has been in the mid 94, 95% range for years. We also know that he got a bigger percentage of the Latino vote, Black vote, whatever you want to call it. We also know that the Republicans got more seats in the House, probably going to keep the Senate. On the state level, they did great. Joe Biden barely campaigned, yet he got 10 million more votes than Barack Obama. It just doesn't add up. Something doesn't make sense. So I'm not talking a legal challenge because yes, there's a burden of proof. Yes, you have to provide evidence, not questioning that. But from a common sense point of view, it just doesn't make any sense.
So here's part of the answer. Number one, Trump draws out voters. There's no question. There's never been a candidate who draws people to the polls like Donald Trump on both sides.
Right.
He draws out people in his favor and he draws out people against him. We all know who got the second largest number of votes in the history of presidential elections after Joe Biden, and that's Donald Trump.
Yeah.
So don't be surprised. Number one, the electorate has expanded. We have more minorities now voting, more people of minority backgrounds now voting. And Donald Trump is a lightning rod. I know people who haven't voted in years, but they're going to vote either for Trump or against Trump. But nobody is neutral about Donald Trump. I think about that myself. When I was a professor at Harvard, my ratings were either the highest in the school or the lowest in the school. You got rated from 0 to 5. I never got 1s, 2s, 3s, or 4s. I got 90% 5s and 10% 0s because nobody was neutral about me. I'm very opinionated. I let my opinions be known, not in the classroom, by the way, but outside the classroom. So look, there is a basis for very, very careful investigation. And this investigation, by the way, won't end on January 20th. There will be scholars, historians, academicians, computer experts, and others looking into these issues. What I want to make sure doesn't happen is I want to see criminalization on both sides reduced. I don't want to see people saying, lock her up, throw her in jail, throw him in jail, lock him up, impeach him on either side. I don't want to see efforts made to put Trump and his family in jail. I don't want to see efforts made to put Biden and his family in jail. But I do want to see lawsuits that produce the truth. The greatest engine of producing truth is cross-examination and subpoenas. And if you can get this cross-examination and subpoenas moving forward, it's going to happen. Look, I know what happens when you're a Trump supporter or when you're perceived as a Trump supporter. Just because I defended President Trump on some of his policies and on the floor of the Senate, I've been the focus of incredible attacks, ranging from false accusations by a woman I never met and never heard of, to efforts to try to ban me from speaking at Harvard. It goes with the territory. You need to develop a thick skin. I fight back. I fight back not only for myself, but for everybody who is a victim of this kind of McCarthyism.
So I have a two-part question. So proud of the way you consistently fight for what you believe in.
Thank you.
The part that concerns me is we have allegations of fraud, which I'll ask you, I'd like to know like how that will be addressed differently than the issue in Pennsylvania. But the second thing that concerns me more than anything else, no matter who ultimately takes the White House, is when you have big tech censoring Republicans, when you have a news media that doesn't cover things fairly and clearly, and then you also now have allegations of election fraud, do those things in your mind in any way outweigh the potential issues that you see with gay rights or Medicare or abortion, which have not really suffered at all under President Trump?
It's a fair point. Look, my brother-in-law, Marvin Cohen, PhD from Harvard, brilliant psychologist, philosopher, opponent of the Vietnam War, very kind of center-left all through his life, grew up in Charleston, a segregated area, has become a rabid Republican. And when we argue, his argument is the one you've just made. He said, I support gay rights. I support a woman's right to choose. I support the environment. I support all of those issues, but I think you've won those battles. They're not in danger. What I worry about is free speech and due process and all of that, and Israel. And on those issues, the Republicans are much better than the Democrats, and the Democrats really pose a problem. I mean, look at what's going on now in Georgia, where the man who may determine the outcome of who controls the Senate, the Reverend Warnock, has called Israel basically war criminals. He says that Israelis shoot down innocent Palestinian unarmed children like birds of prey. He compares the Israeli security barrier to the Berlin Wall without realizing the Berlin Wall was designed to keep good people out of West Berlin, whereas the security barrier was designed to keep bad people, terrorists, out of Tel Aviv, where they kill people. He never mentions the word terrorism, terror tunnels, rockets, incendiary bombs. He just makes it sound as if Israel kills people because they like killing people. That's the man who's running for the United States Senate. And I have publicly stated I cannot support him unless I become convinced that he is completely turned around, made tshuva, made complete repentance, rejected everything he said in the past. Instead, he's just issued some talking points in an op-ed saying, I stand with Israel, I'm a supporter of Israel. That's not good enough for me. And then the man who's running, who I thought I could support, John Ossoff, who's running for the other seat, has just now indicated unequivocal support for Warnock without even asking him any questions, even though he's Jewish. So I have a problem with the Democrats. I have a problem with the left of the Democratic Party and with the squad. Part of the reason I remain a Democrat is I hope to continue to have some influence in marginalizing those extremists. Remember, I threatened to leave the Democratic Party if they had nominated and elected as their chairman a man who had close associations with Farrakhan. Now we've heard that Joe Biden may be considering for his press secretary a woman with a long history of being opposed to AIPAC, being opposed to Israel, being opposed to Jewish lobbying efforts on behalf of Israel. All of that's wrong. And so for me, it's always a work in progress. I don't vote for people based on party. I vote for who I think is going to be the best president, the best governor, the best senator, but I am a Democrat. That could change over time if I think that bipartisanism is dead. I want to see support for Israel remain bipartisan. And look, the reality is that although Trump did so many good things for the Jewish people, so many good things for Israel, and he did get more Black votes and Latino votes than ever before, he did not get more Jewish votes than previous. He maybe a few more, but didn't get what he expected. And every time I've met with President Trump, and it's been, a half a dozen times, he always asks me that question. Why don't Jewish voters appreciate what I have done for Israel? And he says, I don't do it for their votes. I do it because it's in my heart. I do it because I believe in it. I have Jewish grandchildren. I have Jewish children. I believe in this. And I remember sitting with him when he signed the executive order cutting federal funding to colleges and universities that don't do enough to fight against anti-Zionism. And he asked me to say a few words from the White House lectern, and I talked about it as a game changer and how it will make life better for students on university campuses. I appreciate that, and Jewish voters should appreciate it. It doesn't mean that they vote for him. It doesn't mean that they have different priorities in terms of, remember, Israel is not a high priority today among a lot of Jewish voters. They think Israel is safe and secure. Their priority is in other areas. And I think that's a mixed blessing. It shows that Jews are secure in America, but it's easy to become non-secure. You have to wonder, in Germany in the 1920s, when Jews felt very secure during the Weimar Republic, how many of them looked to Jewish issues when they cast their vote? Or in England. See, in England, there's been a reversal because the Labour Party went so far anti-Israel with Jeremy Corbyn that virtually all the Jewish supporters of Labour, and remember in the old days, Jewish support for Labour was like Jewish support for Democrats. Very few Jews supported the Conservative Party, like relatively few Jews support the Republican Party. And that shifted almost overnight with the election of Corbyn as the leader of the Labour Party. It may shift back now, I don't know. And it's hard for me to understand why more Jewish voters remain Democrat and would probably still remain Democrat. I mean, the pro-Israel lobby, the pro-Israel Jews are fortunate in the sense that Biden was nominated instead of Elizabeth Warren or instead of Bernie Sanders. Remember, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren both refused to attend Benjamin Netanyahu's speech. And I called Liz Warren, who I, of course, knew for 25 years as my colleague, and I told her that was a red line for me. Not going to hear Netanyahu was a red line for me. You'd go to hear Castro, you'd go to hear the head of China, you'd go to hear probably Erdogan, but you won't go to hear Benjamin Netanyahu. That's a red line for me. I could never again support you. But the Democrats didn't nominate Liz Warren. They didn't nominate Bernie Sanders. They did nominate Joe Biden, who is generally more pro-Israel, more to the center. But I have a job. I have to keep my eye on the Biden administration, a very close eye on the Biden administration. And I have to keep the sort of Damocles hanging. I will not remain a Democrat if I think the Democratic Party is turned against Israel as a party. I think young Democrats have turned against Israel. And that may be the future of the Democratic Party, in which case I'm not part of it. But at the moment, I'm still staying a Democrat to fight that fight within the party.
Well, I maintain you'd have more influence moving over to the other side and getting the social issues that you want approved by many Republicans.
Well, that would be great. If we can do that, I'll make a deal with you. If we can get the Republicans to become like the Conservative Party in England. Remember, the Conservative Party in England is opposed to the death penalty, supports a woman's right to choose, is in favor of gay marriage, is very strong on the environment, reasonable gun control. All of those are part of the conservative. If you can get the Republicans to do that, that'll make life easy for people like me.
Professor Dershowitz, your last responses were a perfect segue to my next question. Are you reading my notes? Why has anti-Semitism risen so much in recent years, and specifically, why so much of it? Why has it found such a home in the Democratic Party?
Well, first of all, if you're as old as I am, and almost nobody is these days, I'm 82. I'll have to brag a little about my background to make this point. I'll start by saying I was a terrible elementary school student, a terrible high school student. I got C's, straight through elementary school and high school. My mother always said, get B's. I never got a B. Right from high school, I went to Brooklyn College where I got straight A's, and then Yale Law School where I got straight A's. I was first in my class. I was editor-in-chief of the Yale Law Journal. I was going to be a law clerk, and I got turned down by 32 out of 32 Wall Street firms. That's what anti-Semitism was like in 1960, 1961. My son graduated the Yale Law School 25 years after me. All of the same firms recruited him and wanted him and promised him all kinds of things. So in 25 years, it changed. So when you compare anti-Semitism today with what it was 60 years ago, it was much worse. You couldn't live in certain parts of certain cities. I live on the east side of New York today on Sutton Place. I couldn't rent an apartment on Sutton Place in the 1950s or 1960s. So anti-Semitism has changed. The kind of polite, cultural, upper-class anti-Semitism has virtually disappeared. It's still hard for a Jew to get into the Everglades Club in Palm Beach, which is why Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago has been so successful. But that's ended. What really has built up more than ever is anti-Zionism, which often morphs into anti-Semitism, particularly on college campuses. And it's this hatred for Israel and everything relating to Israel. And there's no good reason for it. Israel is a liberal democracy, which has, strong support on both sides of the political spectrum, and it should. But we're seeing increasing anti-Zionism and increasing anti-Semitism on campus. And you're absolutely right. It's coming mostly from the hard left wing of the Democratic Party, and we have to fight that. We have to stop it. We have to call it out. And that's why the Warnock election is an important one. A lot of my friends are furious at me for writing the piece I wrote. I wrote a piece in Newsweek magazine about why I can't support Warnock and why I'd rather see the Senate in the hands of Republicans than to see a senator like Warnock, unless he would have changed his views completely, in the United States Senate. What they're saying to me is, oh, I'm a one-issue voter. I'm putting my Jewish values in front of American values. No, I think it's bad for America to have anti-Semites and anti-Zionists in the United States Senate. And I'll continue to fight that fight, and I'll continue to make enemies. Look, the Democrats hate me for not going down the line, supporting everything they say, and for being willing to see the Senate go to the Republicans. A lot of Republicans, you should read some of my emails from right-wing Republicans, insulting me, attacking me because I'm not Republican enough, or I'm not pro-Trump enough, or I'm not, right-wing enough, etc. So I'll always have enemies on both sides. I'll always be a centrist. I can be a centrist liberal or a centrist conservative. The difference between centrist liberals and centrist conservatives is very small, much smaller than the difference between centrist liberals and radicals on the left. I have much more in common with Joel Pollack and my friends at Breitbart and my friends on the conservative side. I have much more in common with them than I do with the people on the extreme left of the Democratic Party. So let's see what happens. I'm 82, hopefully in the next, what do I have, until 120? So I have another 28, 38 to go. Maybe I'll change. Maybe I'll become a Republican before 120. It's possible.
Well, we're going to continue to work on you the best we can.
Okay, good.
We have a lot of questions from our audience. One is from David B. He's also an attorney, and he wrote this: legislatures in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia, and Nevada also statutorily required that mail ballots must be signature checked before tabulation. So if the Supreme Court of the United States rules that accepting late received ballots in Pennsylvania was unconstitutional, then wouldn't that also apply to non-signature checked mail ballots?
If the legislatures did in fact require signature check ballots, that's the law. And under Bush versus Gore, I think the United States Supreme Court might very well enforce that law. You'd have to have the numbers. You'd have to have a number of non-signature check ballots that were in violation of state legislation that would change the outcome of the election before the Supreme Court would take the case.
How do you know that if they mix them all in and you don't even
Well,
know?
that's the question. That's what Alito did. He segregated them out. I don't know what you would do if there were no way of discerning how many were signature checked. You'd have to get affidavits. You'd have to put together a circumstantial case.
Professor, we have a great question here from Michelle L. Her concern is that Biden will take on the perspective of J Street and how he deals with Israel. And I don't think J Street is a friend of Israel. I don't care what anyone says. So
I agree with you.
Okay,
I completely agree with you. I think J Street is an enemy of Israel. J Street supported the Iran deal. Nobody in Israel supports the Iran deal. Nobody. I don't know a single person in Israel who supported the Iran deal with sunset provisions and with no real inspection. J Street supported it. J Street was silent, never even praised Israel for normalizing relationships with the Gulf states. J Street is not pro-Israel. Go on its website. You will find 100 anti-Israel statements for every one that's kind of a talking point pap on pro-Israel. But you're absolutely right. And I worry about that. I worry that he'll appoint somebody like Ben Rhodes, who was very anti-Israel in the Obama administration. I don't worry as much if he appoints Tony Blinken, who was in the Obama administration and who is somewhere between J Street and AIPAC. He's in neither camp, but I think he's a rational, thoughtful person. Look, I'd rather have strong pro-Israel people in the administration. This administration, David Friedman, you could not get a better ambassador. I spoke to David. I speak to him all the time. He's this wonderful, wonderful man. By the way, when he finishes his job, you should have him speak. He's a great speaker, and he's just a wonderful man. And he was instrumental in the Abraham Accords. So he's been terrific. I think Mike Pompeo, who's a former student of mine,
will you introduce us to them? We'd love to have them on the show.
Just tell them I recommended it. And these are people who the other person you should have is my other former student, Ted Cruz. And he's very strongly supportive of Israel and Jewish issues. And a lot of these people have been very helpful on these issues. So, I praise when praise is deserving, and I condemn. I condemned in the strongest terms the Obama administration. I voted for him twice. Second time, I regret my vote. I now wish I had voted the other way on the second time. But I condemned him with the Iran deal, and I condemned him in particularly strong terms to the point where it ended our personal relationship. I condemned him in the strongest terms for allowing that UN resolution to go through as he was leaving office in December of 2016, which condemned Israel's control over the Kotel, the Western Wall, the holiest place in Judaism, as flagrantly violative of international law. That is just a lie. That's like saying that the Catholic control of the Vatican is in violation of international law. It's the most important part of Judaism, the Jewish quarter, the access roads to Hebrew University and Hadassah Hospital, all of which were condemned as flagrant violations of international law. And Obama allowed that, not only allowed it to go through, he engineered it. And my personal relationship with him ended over that. We no longer speak.
We have some questions. You have such courage to be able to speak out no matter what the consequences. And that's something I've always admired about you. John P. is asking about election fraud and how that will affect not only this current election and future elections, which goes to my question. If they determine and they do present evidence that there really was extensive election fraud, is there enough time to be able to get that to the Supreme Court to make a ruling? And what would the ruling potentially be?
Very good question and very hard question. Pennsylvania case, it's fine. It's already in the Supreme Court, already decided 5-4. They could bring it back to the Supreme Court. I think that would probably win if the votes were these fraud allegations are going to be difficult. It's not the goal to get it resolved by December 14th. The goal is to have enough plausible challenges in front of the courts so that secretaries of state won't certify sufficient votes by December 14th. If you can get a number of state secretaries of state not to certify the votes, then Biden doesn't have the necessary 270. There's another wrinkle. This is a hard one. And nobody has answered this. In fact, I don't know that anybody has alerted it. Let's assume that Pennsylvania doesn't certify its electors at all, because there's a conflict. Just hypothetically, Pennsylvania doesn't certify its electors. So now, instead of there being 539 electors, 538. Instead of being 538 electors, there are now 518 electors. Do you need a majority of the 538 or a majority of the 518? That's the question that nobody has quite answered. The text of the Constitution is a majority of the electors chosen or selected by the state legislature. So there are a lot of novel constitutional questions that have never been answered. And will we get answers? I don't know whether we will, but it's going to be a challenge for the courts. And if it ever gets there, it'll only get there if the votes are there. So I think the vote counting is the most important thing. Only if we have enough votes that are challenged, plausibly challenged, to make a difference, will we get to the point where these issues come up.
Professor, I think it was Mark Twain that said, history may not repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. And we know totalitarian regimes in the past. So there's a newly elected person in California that basically said that the 73 million Trump voters need to be sent to a re-education camp. Then you have AOC saying we need to keep a list of these people. The list goes on and on and on. So we have a question from an anonymous attendee that says, do you expect harsher censorship in a Biden administration?
Yes, I do. And I worry about Twitter. I worry about Facebook. And remember, there's this provision of law, Section 230, which gives exemptions to platforms like Twitter and like Facebook, but only if they're really platforms. And just yesterday, one of them marked a conservative description of one of the lawyers for Trump as untrue, unfactual. That turns them from a platform into a publisher. And just like the New York Times doesn't have exemption for defamation, and CNN doesn't have exemption for defamation, how do I know that? I'm suing them for a lot of money because they doctored my statement in front of the Senate. They took out the words illegal and unlawful. I said the president couldn't be impeached if he did something lawful that was for his own reelection. And they took out the words and made it sound like I said a president can kill anybody or tamper with the votes or do anything illegal. So I'm suing them for a lot of money. They don't have any exemption. And Facebook and Twitter shouldn't have an exemption if they engage in censorship. So they have a choice. Either be a platform in which everybody goes on and then you get your exemption, or be a publisher, in which case you can choose what to put on, what to not to put on. That's your choice. But then you're subject to being sued for defamation. But I think we're going to see less sensitivity to that concern in a Democratic administration than in a Republican administration. But I don't think we're going to see gulags. I don't think we're going to see the Harvard petition enacted, but we'll see something that's almost as bad. We'll see silent recriminations, below the radar recriminations. We'll see people not getting jobs. We'll see people not getting admitted to universities. We'll see people not getting promotions on the faculty because they supported Trump. We'll see people not getting invitations, not getting honorary doctorates because they supported Trump. I will never again get another honorary doctorate. I've gotten, a lot of them. I'll never again get another honorary doctorate from a university because if I did, there would be disruptions and protests based on my defense of President Trump in front of the Senate. So I knew that, I understood that, and I made the decision that doing the right thing was more important than having another plaque on my wall. If you can see in the background, I got a lot of plaques on my wall, a lot of pictures and stuff. So I don't need another plaque, but for other people, not getting promoted, not getting tenure, not getting grants, that may all be in the offing. So we have to keep our eye on that and make sure that this new form of McCarthyism doesn't operate if and when the Democrats take control.
I so agree with you. The only award we were able to give you is when we pinned a JRA pin on you at your last.
Uh-huh.
I
I had to take
on.
it off before I got home. Otherwise, my wife would never see me.
We're still
Right.
working. We have a question from Michelle L., and I'll add to it. She says, how will Biden vote on Israel at the UN? I mean, we just got off a great run in the UN where people like Nikki Haley said the days of bullying Israel and UN are over, to an administration who is now privately apologizing to Arab leaders for distancing himself from Linda Sarsour at his convention. I'm greatly concerned about, and I share Michelle's concerns as well.
I agree with you. First of all, I think a lot of Muslim and Arab voters are claiming that they gave the margin of victory to Biden in states like Michigan. Excuse me. I don't know whether that's true or not, but they're claiming it. Look, every group claims that. The key is going to be who he appoints as his national security advisor, who he appoints as Secretary of State and Defense, who he appoints as permanent representative to the United Nations. And we'll be able to get and see that. And of course, those require Senate confirmation. So the Republicans will have a job to do too. Assuming the Republicans maintain control of the Senate, the Republicans will have to flex their muscles to make sure that people in those positions, not all of them are subject to confirmation, but most of them aren't confirmed if they're anti-Israel. That's something Republicans ought to do.
I agree.
We have another question here from Gary G that says, is Biden strong enough to withstand the hard left turn that his party and his administration has taken?
It's a very hard question. I don't know the answer. I'll give you a hypothetical that may happen. So assume for a moment that the Democrats get control of the Senate. And the first thing that's going to happen is AOC and Liz Warren are going to introduce resolutions to pack the Supreme Court, to add 3 justices, 3 Democrats, 3 progressive justices to the Supreme Court. It may very well pass the House, and if the Democrats control the Senate, pass the Senate. So it comes in front of Biden's desk to sign. He is against it personally. He does not support court packing. Would he have the courage to veto a House Senate law that packed the courts? I don't know the answer to that question. There's a big difference between not supporting something and vetoing something. It takes a lot of strength to veto something. That means going against majorities of your party in both houses. I would hope he would. I would certainly urge him to. Don't know if he'll still listen to me. I've known him for a long time. I respect him. He respects me. But because of my support for Trump against impeachment, he may not be seeking my advice. I don't know whether he will. Every previous president has sought my advice on Israel, on justices, judges. I don't know whether that will continue or that has ended. We'll wait and see. But Biden's he's a guy, he has his own opinion, and he's a man of the people, and he has a warm spot in his heart for Israel. Maybe not so much for Netanyahu. He and Netanyahu have gotten along much better than Obama got along with Netanyahu. But once when I was in Israel with Netanyahu, Biden was there, and some of Netanyahu's enemies arranged for housing expansion permits to be publicly disclosed the night Biden was supposed to have dinner with Netanyahu. And Biden was pretty upset about that because it embarrassed him. It wasn't something Bibi did. It was something that his enemies to the right of him did. But, there have been some tensions. But I think generally Joe Biden is much more warmly inclined toward Israel than Barack Obama, Liz Warren, Bernie Sanders. It's interesting. So many of the strongest opponents of Israel are Jewish. Cohen from Tennessee is not a friend of Israel. Obviously, J Street is not a friend of Israel. Bernie Sanders would have been the most anti-Israel presidential candidate in history if he had been nominated. Fortunately, he was not. if he gets a position in the administration, I hope he's stuck somewhere in the Labor Department or somewhere where he can't influence this kind of policy, but I'd hate to see him in the cabinet. We'll wait and see. But remember, the Republicans have a role to play. If they control the Senate, they have a role to play in not confirming candidates who are overtly anti-Israel.
I agree with you. It sounds like the Biden administration is now an open book. We don't know what to expect if he gets.
We don't know. No.
But we do know what President Trump's record has been when it comes to Jews and Israel.
There's no question about that. Yeah.
Wrong one.
Let's take the last couple of questions. I have another appointment at 4 o'clock. So.
Okay. Final question for you then. Marlene W. asks about the role of the news media and how that affected the election. And most conservatives have also seen a big shift in Fox News's coverage, with the exception of maybe their evening coverage, where it had become decisively more toward the left. What effect happened, and why is that happening?
There is no such thing as news coverage. There's no way you can go to get news today. There's no such thing as news. There's only opinion. The New York Times ran a front page story the other day saying, Trump invites Michigan legislatures to the White House in order to subvert the election. Is that news in order to subvert the election? That deserves to be on the editorial page. If that's your opinion, fine. But the New York Times mixes news and opinion. CNN doesn't even bother to have news. It's just all opinion. I don't know what's going on with Fox. I'm a lot on Newsmax. Newsmax to this day has not called the election because they want to see state certification. And they've been doing, I think, good coverage and good analysis. There's no question that the news stations have a big impact on elections. And why was Jeffrey Toobin always wrong on everything he ever said on CNN? And why was I always right? Not because I'm smarter than Jeffrey Toobin, even though I was his teacher, because I don't allow my personal views to interfere with my legal analysis. What he does and calls legal analysis is always wishful thinking. This is what the Supreme Court's going to do because I want it to do that. It's kind of the Larry Tribe theory of jurisprudence. Larry Tribe's theory of jurisprudence is if Larry approves of it, it must be the law. And if Larry approves of it, it must be in the Constitution. And he'll go to any length to prove that tribism is constitutionalism, whereas I call it as I see it. And if it comes out against my views, so be it. If it comes out in favor of my views, so be it. We're not seeing that kind of journalism anymore. Walter Cronkite could not get a job today on a major network. He's just too neutral, too objective. I knew Walter Cronkite toward the end of his life. And, he wouldn't even tell anybody who he voted for, or if he voted. He was so neutral and so objective. We're not seeing that today, certainly not on cable television. What's going on with Fox? I don't know. Are they hedging their bets? I don't know. Are they the new management, the Sons? I don't know what's going on. I haven't been on Fox very much lately either. I don't know why, but they call me from time to time and then they cancel. So I don't know, but I've been on Newsmax a lot and I write my op-eds and I'm on. If you want to hear me, just tune into my podcast. It's 5 days a week. It's called The Dershow, like my name. The only thing it's missing is the wits, and the wits are provided by my listeners. So that forms Dershow. You can get it on Spotify, iTunes, YouTube. You can subscribe to it, and you'll hear my very, very sharp opinions on every issue. I've been talking a lot about attempts to try to punish Republicans lately. So you'll be interested. So thanks for having me on, and thanks for giving me an opportunity to speak to your very excellent group of people.
Thank you. We've been broadcasting how to reach your podcast, so our members have the information at their screens right now.
Yeah.
Good.
Professor Dershowitz,
keep being grateful.
Yeah, we're so very grateful for your life's work, standing up for justice and fair treatment under the law for all Americans. And again, I want you to know that you will always have a friend in us and the JRA.
Well, thank you so much. You'll always have a friend in me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Be well. Bye.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. The Jewish Republican is uniting and energizing conservatives to take action on behalf of America and Israel. If you want to hear this show, if some of your friends have missed it, you can go to our YouTube channel and watch it there. If you want to join our organization and join our alliance or make a donation, you can go to jewishrepublicanalliance.org. So thank you so much for being here. Until we meet again, Shabbat Shalom. Everybody have a good weekend, and we will see you soon. Bye-bye.
Shabbat shalom.